In this lecture, we'll be examining the Spring Offensive of 1975, a campaign that brought to a close 30 years of war in Vietnam. The 1975 Spring Offensive would soon become known as the Ho Chi Minh Offensive, in honor of the late North Vietnamese leader. North Vietnamese military planners initially envisioned a two-stage offensive that would take approximately 2 years to complete. However, early victories by NVA and Viet Cong forces considerably sped up this timetable. The precursor to the 1975 Spring Offensive was an attack on the town of Phuoc Long, which began in December 1974. The town is about 75 miles northwest of Saigon and very close to the Cambodian border. A number of important highways ran past Phuoc Long, making the region important for logistical purposes. The battle also served as a test to see if the new American president, Gerald Ford, would honor the promises that former President Nixon made to the South Vietnamese about support. The lack of American support during the battle gave the North Vietnamese clear indication that the United States would not re-enter the war to defend South Vietnam. In less than 1 month, the Communists had captured the entirety of the Bien Phuoc province. The first official phase of the Spring Offensive in 1975 was what the North Vietnamese referred to as Campaign 275. The goal of this campaign was to capture the Tay Nguyen region, known to the Americans as the Central Highlands, which is located in green on this map. The capture of the Central Highlands region would effectively cut South Vietnam into 2 pieces. The pivotal battle of the Central Highlands campaign took place at Bun Mi Tot. However, the North Vietnamese plan called for diversionary attacks at Pleiku and Kon Tum in order to trick South Vietnamese military commanders into deploying most of their troops away from the real objective. You can see on this map that Bun Mi Tot is further to the south, Pleiku and Kon Tum are to the north in the Central Highlands. When the battle started, the city of Bun Mi Tot was poorly defended, and North Vietnamese troops captured the city in 2 weeks. The image on the left depicts South Vietnamese President Thieu inspecting military facilities at Hue in February 1975. The map on the right shows the plan that Thieu envisioned for South Vietnam after regrouping further south. All territory in the I Corps and half of the 2 Corps zones, or the northern half of the country, would be sacrificed in favor of holding on to the southern half of the country. On March 14, 1975, President Thieu ordered the withdrawal of all our ARVN forces from I Corps and 2 Corps in the Central Highlands. Unfortunately for Thieu, the retreat by South Vietnamese forces from the Central Highlands region was a disaster. The image on this slide depicts the gridlock on Route 7 leading out of the Central Highlands, one of the main roads to the region. Retreating South Vietnamese soldiers and frightened civilians tried to evacuate the region, but the roads were inadequate to handle the sudden influx of hundreds of thousands of people, vehicles, and military equipment. This mass of military personnel and civilians was unable to dodge the shelling, snipers, and aerial assaults of the North Vietnamese army. Nearly 30,000 South Vietnamese soldiers were killed or captured in the chaos of this retreat, while many thousands of civilians were killed in the carnage, perhaps as many as 100,000. This deadly journey is sometimes known as the Convoy of Tears. The Central Highlands campaign cost South Vietnam's 2 Corps more than 75% of its combat units, while casualties incurred by the North Vietnamese were relatively light at approximately 3,000 killed or wounded soldiers. The North Vietnamese also captured or destroyed thousands of weapons, hundreds of tanks, armored vehicles, aircraft, and artillery pieces. After splitting South Vietnam into 2 sections after the Central Highlands campaign, the North Vietnamese shifted 5 divisions north and targeted the northern sector of its bisected enemy. Of chief importance were the cities of Hue and Da Nang. Hue was the historical imperial capital of Vietnam, while Da Nang was the second largest city at the time in South Vietnam. In the cities of Hue and Da Nang, most ARVN units just gave up without putting up much resistance. In fact, part of the problem was the officers of many of these units fled, leaving troops without leadership and having to fend for themselves. By March 29th of 1975, North Vietnamese troops had full control of Hue and Da Nang. After routing the South Vietnamese forces in the central highlands, the North Vietnamese and their Viet Cong allies began to drive to the coastal cities of the central region. The key targets were the cities of Quy Nhon, Tuy Hoa, and Nha Trang, which you can see in the red stars on this map. The blue stars indicate the earlier battles in the Central Highlands, the red stars, the locations of the coastal cities. By the end of March and beginning of April of 1975, NVA and Viet Cong troops controlled over half of the territory of South Vietnam. This image from late March 1975 depicts military personnel and civilians crowded together on a naval vessel being evacuated from Hue. Very few of the fleeing refugees in Hue and Da Nang ever made it to safety in the south. By the middle of April 1975, the South Vietnamese government controlled less than 20% of the territory that was part of the borders of the nation, established in 1954 under the Geneva Accords. This rapid collapse was much faster than North Vietnamese officials could have even dreamed, as at the start of 1975, South Vietnam had a well-equipped army that was one of the largest in the world. However, technological advantages could not make up for morale and structural problems of the ARVN. The decisive military engagement that led to the fall of Saigon and ultimately the fall of the Republic of Vietnam was the Battle of Xuan Loc, a town located northeast of Saigon. Unlike some earlier engagements with the ARVN in the Spring Offensive, the Communist forces faced stiff resistance this time by outnumbered South Vietnamese troops. Still, the outgunned and outmanned ARVN forces could only hold out about 2 weeks against the surging Communist forces. Xuan Loc was a pivotal logistical and transportation hub that opened the gates to Saigon, literally and figuratively. President Thieu, facing pressure from opponents amid his mishandling of the war effort, resigned on April 21st. The South Vietnamese leader blamed the United States for the fall of South Vietnam first by its forcing South Vietnam to abide by the Paris Peace Accords, and then for failing to support South Vietnam in the years after the peace treaty. Thieu was replaced by Vice President Tran, who would be replaced on April 28th by General Duong Nguyen. This image depicts a soldier aiming a weapon at refugees trying to climb the gates of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon in late April 1975. Vietnamese citizens desperate to leave the country sought any route they could find to escape. This iconic photograph by Dutch photographer Hubert van Es shows evacuees boarding an Air America helicopter at 22 Gia Long Street in Saigon, April 29th. The building at the time housed employees of the United States Agency for International Development, plus also contains some Central Intelligence Agency offices. Most Americans in Saigon had already been evacuated by the time this image was taken. People trying to board the helicopter were mostly Vietnamese. The improvised helicopter landing pad was actually the top of an elevator shaft of the building. At the time the image was published, many Americans believed that this image was taken at the U.S. Embassy and not at an apartment building. They were American citizens struggling to get out of the country. A misconception, again, most were Vietnamese. The image on this slide is that of North Vietnamese tank number 843 as it smashes the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon on April 30th, 1975. The still photograph represents the symbolic end to 30 years of fighting in Vietnam. The image was captured by French war photographer François de Mulder, who was one of the few Western journalists still in South Vietnam at the time of the fall. She would later become the first woman to win the World Press Photo Award for some work she did in Lebanon. This event, the smashing of the gates, would become the emblematic end to the war, and the city of Saigon was spared annihilation by the decision by General Min to announce an unconditional surrender on April 30th. After the communists took over, they renamed Saigon Ho Chi Minh City. This draws to a close our look at the 1975 Spring Offensive.